Welcome to the Commonwealth Policy Center Candidate Forum. I'm Richard Nelson, Executive Director. And on this edition, we're going to talk about the Secretary of State race. And with me is Michael Adams, Republican candidate for Secretary of State. I should mention that his opponent, Heather French Henry, has been invited, but she has declined to participate. So, Mr. Adams, this means that you will have the full 28 minutes to tell the voters a little bit about yourself. And let's start there. Give us a little bit of your background. Tell us about your family, work history, and that kind of thing.
Well, Richard, thank you for this opportunity. And thank all of you for watching. I'm Michael Adams. I'm the Republican nominee for the Secretary of State, which is our chief election official. And my background is I grew up in Paducah, in a working class union household, first in my family to have the opportunity to go to college and get a degree. I used that then to dedicate my life and career to bringing about change in a conservative direction and policy. I did well enough in college to get into Harvard Law School, went there on low-income aid, and then came back to Kentucky to have my career and raise my family. What I do is I have a national election law practice for conservative causes and candidates in all 50 states and all 5 territories. I've done races in all these states, working on ballot access, recounts, ethics compliance, campaign finance. They gave me the opportunity to master the subject matter of elections. And now I'm using that to run for the chief election official job in Kentucky.
Okay. So you do have experience working in election law, and the state Secretary of State position requires some knowledge with that election law. In fact, you're the state's top election officer. You certify elections. You make sure that things are being done correctly, the voting machines are working correctly, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, it sounds like your background has suited you for this position.
I believe so. People have asked me for years about running for office myself. I've done 400 other campaigns for others I've worked to elect, and it never really occurred to me to run for those other offices, but this office came open, and I thought it was a perfect fit for what I do and what I've spent my career doing.
So, Michael, when you say that you've been involved with 400 other campaigns, was this in the capacity of legal counsel? What did you do?
Well, I'm counting campaigns going back to the early 90s when I was a teenager. Before I was even old enough to vote, I was consulting on campaigns, trying to help conservative candidates win offices from local, state, everything in between. Mm-hmm. So that's where I got started. And then over time, I went from being a volunteer to a campaign staffer on the payroll to ultimately being the attorney for the campaigns.
Okay. So another thing that the Secretary of State does is they work with business filings. Businesses have to register with the Secretary of State's office. Oftentimes you hear of rationale of why somebody's running or what they will do once they're in office. Is there anything that can be done in that office to make it more efficient or easier for businesses to file with the state?
Well, so there are a number of responsibilities this office has. Primarily, they are administrative, documenting records, legislative records, business records, that sort of thing. Largely, that is stamping and filing documents. It doesn't have a lot of policy to it. On that front, I want to improve the website. I'm an attorney. I have my own firm that I do the filings for. I have business clients that I do their filings for. So I'm familiar with the website. I'd like to update it. It can be vastly improved. I also want to use the platform of this office to try to spur a conversation about how we improve the environment for job creators, specifically entrepreneurs. But to be totally frank, the office is one of enumerated powers. I'm a small government conservative and an originalist, and I think you got to follow the laws it reads. So the only area where I'm giving clear policy authorities in the election field.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that you're a conservative, you're an originalist. I'm thinking these are terms that we'll hear a little bit when it comes to the judiciary, but is a role for a constitutional office like Secretary of State. It sounds like you're, in some senses, limiting yourself to what you can do, which is not the tendency of people once they're in office. They often expand and go beyond maybe what they should do. Is it? And here's where I want to go with this. maybe in the more of a philosophical line, Mike, is it more challenging for a conservative, once they're in office, to maintain fidelity to the Constitution, to be that originalist, to govern conservatively?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'm saying that is we're watching presidential candidates in the Democratic side of things promising all kinds of things: free education, free health care. So I'm curious, as a candidate and then as somebody who may be elected to Secretary of State, is it tougher to be a conservative and then to govern conservatively?
Yeah, one of the biggest problems we have in government today, I think, is that people don't have a full understanding of what government's supposed to do what level of government's supposed to fix the roads versus fix education. Yeah. I'll be honest, most of the questions I get on the trail, I've campaigned in 104 counties so far, and I get a lot of questions about immigration and foreign policy and things that I don't opioids, all kinds of things that I don't regulate in this office if I'm successful in winning it. So part of what I want to use this office for is civic education, to have a better explanation to the public of what office does what, so they'll know who to call if they've got a problem. So part of the problem is the public expectation that every elected official's job is to fix every problem. Number one, not all problems can be fixed by the government, but number two, the ones that can be fixed by the government have to be fixed by a particular government.
I appreciate that response, because often, even though we've all taken civics in grade school, we're supposed to know the three branches of government. We're supposed to understand the idea of federalism, that you've got the local, the state, and then the federal levels of government. I think sometimes as we get older, we forget that. But you bring up a good point about the fact that government can't fix everything. In a free country, government is not tasked with fixing everything. In fact, in a free country, people are given the freedom and the opportunity to craft solutions that fit best for them, for their family, for their community, in what works for them. Is that something we've forgotten? Just that we are free, and that freedom entails the ability of the individual to figure it out, or to work within their family, or to work within their community to come up with a solution.
Yeah, President Reagan famously said that freedom is only one generation away from extinction, and I really believe that. And that's especially true today when you see polling that shows that millennials and Generation Z tend to self-identify as socialists more than capitalists. That's terrifying. I'd like to see, you mentioned civics classes. I never had a civics class when I was growing up, and I don't think that most schools today have them. Part of what I want to use this office for, I'd say one of the big differences between me and the incumbent is she's used this platform to advocate for marijuana legalization. We can have those debates, but this is not really a policy that this office should be involved in either way. But I do want to use this office to advance policy discussion on something like civics education. Right now, we don't have to have civics education in our schools, and we haven't in the last 30 years in most jurisdictions.
So does this mean that you would lobby the legislature to enact a law requiring civics education in public schools?
Well, before I want to advocate for a top-down solution from Frankfurt, I want to have conversations around the state with the site-based decision-making councils. But that's where my heart is. Yeah, this ought to be a requirement, I think. I'd like to see civics education. I'd like to see economics education. Talking about why kids are socialists today is because they don't know about capitalism and how it works and how it benefits us.
So I'm curious if I could push into this a little bit. Does this mean that you would like to travel, or are you willing to travel to public schools and not just talk to the site-based councils, but to talk to students themselves about civics and what's the nature of our polity and what their role is as citizens? Are you willing to talk to the students about this?
Absolutely. That's actually one of the statutory duties of this office, is to be the chief civic advocate, to have a contest, an essay contest, to promote civics. That's a good start, but I really want to do a lot more than that.
So tell us what more. So you mentioned site-based councils, possibly going to the legislature. What other things would involve encouraging good citizenship? And the reason I think this is important is because we've forgotten what it means to be a good citizen, what kind of a political structure we have. And along the lines of where millennials are thinking, that many of them are leaning towards socialism, there's a real concern because our political system and our economic system is not compatible with socialism. So what other things would you do if maybe you've not thought that far, but I'm curious if there are other things that you...
Well, people ask me quite a bit about low voter turnout, and
Yeah.
I think it's a problem. I find it frustrating, but it's the second most frustrating thing behind something else, which is a bigger problem and helps lead to the low voter turnout, which is lack of information. To put this in context, I'm a pretty well-informed individual. I read several newspapers a day. I'm in politics professionally because of what I do for conservative causes and candidates across the country, including here. So I'm a pretty well-informed guy. I try to be informed before I vote, but even for me, it's hard for me to know sometimes who to vote for, especially in a primary, especially in a judicial race. I just don't have the information I need, or a local race. It used to be, here's how much things have changed over the years. It used to be people knew their city councilman or their county commissioner, but they didn't know their member of Congress. And our system is designed with that assumption in mind. Your local government, you know best, and they're best equipped to govern. But things have flipped because now we know who our member of Congress is, but we don't know who our neighbors are, let alone our city councilman. So I think part of what we do is have to improve that. One thing I want to do with this office, it will cost little to nothing, is provide free web space to every single candidate for every single public office in the state. Just a little bit of space online for them to provide a statement and a picture and a link to a website. When I filed to run for this office, the Secretary of State's office gave me that opportunity, which is good for a statewide candidate, but I'm a statewide candidate. I can already afford to buy a website and television, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. If you're running for mayor of Thornhill, Kentucky, where I live, you don't have those kinds of resources, and the public doesn't have a way to learn about you and your campaign and what you want to do. So to me, the best way to fix low turnout is to provide more information, because turnout's not just about who comes to the polls. It's also about undervoting. People may come and vote for the governor, but then skip the rest of the races because they don't know anything about my race or the AG race or what have you. That's a separate problem that's also here.
Very good. A plug for Commonwealth Policy Center, by the way. We do have information on all of the constitutional offices that will be on the ballot. It will be on our website soon. We'll have voter guides for each of those races. So check out commonwealthpolicycenter.org. If you're just tuning in, I'm with Michael Adams. He is the Republican candidate for Secretary of State. And we're talking about this position, why it's important, what the role of Secretary of State does. Mike, there was a news item recently about a federal judge's order ordering Kentucky to clean up its voter rolls. There are a number of people on our voting rolls that have either moved out of the state. A number of people are dead that just have not been removed. The judge ordered 167,000 names to be removed in 2020 if one of two things doesn't happen. If they don't vote this election, or if they don't go into their county clerk's office and update their address, or just confirm that they're still alive and living at that particular address. The Kentucky Democratic Party has cried foul. They said this is wrong. They're disenfranchising voters. And did they have a point, or was the federal judge correct in saying that Kentucky needs to clean up its voter rolls?
Well, a little bit of context. There's a law called the National Voter Registration Act. It was passed by a Democratic Congress and signed by Bill Clinton into law. There's a state version of the same law. It was passed by a Democratic General Assembly and signed by Burton Jones, a Democratic governor. Here's why I mention all of that. The allegation by the Democratic Party and by Greg Stumbo and by Secretary Grimes is that this is a partisan move by Republicans to try to knock Democrats off the voter rolls, keep them from voting. That's total absurdity. This is simply about fidelity to the law. The last Secretary of State to adequately maintain the voter rolls was Trey Grayson, the last Republican Secretary of State. And he did his job. He followed the law. He followed federal law. He followed state law. We've not adequately maintained our voter rolls over the last decade. The Democratic Party has been in charge of our elections for the last decade, and not only have they not followed federal and state law and taken people off the rolls that we know don't live here anymore or are dead, but it's one thing after another in this office. You've got an incumbent Democratic official, chief election official, who's under investigation on multiple fronts, civil and criminal investigations, for retaliating against whistleblowers, Democrats and Republicans, discrimination in hiring, refusal to clean up the rolls, obviously, a no-bid contract to a major donor, misuse of the voter file for personal and political purposes. And that was all capped off, speaking of federal judges, by 10 federal felony convictions a couple of weeks ago in Frankfurt of the Secretary of State's father for tampering with her election when she ran for the U.S. Senate. And part of the evidence that was shown in that case was that it wasn't just that election that was tainted with illegal and undisclosed money, but also the 2 elections for Secretary of State. So this office is in a great crisis now, and it comes down to simply disregard for the law.
So there is a cloud hanging over the Secretary of State's office, and I'd like us to go back to the cleaning up the voter rolls, which is one of the obligations of Secretary of State. And if you could explain to the viewers why it's important to have clean voter rolls. And when I say clean voter rolls, we're talking about ensuring that those who are on the list to be eligible to vote are actually alive and residing at the address that the list says that they're at. So why is it important for that list to be updated? And this might very much a softball, but I think we need to talk about
Well,
that.
the short answer is if we have rolls that have people on here that live somewhere else, they can vote somewhere else and vote here. They can double vote. And that actually happens. It's a real problem. We've got records of, as you put it, over 100,000 people that we know moved away. We belong to an interstate compact where we get information from other states about who's registered, and we tell them our information. We get information from the Postal Service about change of address. And it's a unique problem that we have because A, we've got people on our rolls who don't live here and can vote elsewhere, and B, we don't have a photo ID law for voters in Kentucky. It's a perfect storm, those two together.
So voter ID and the term election integrity, that's something that we hear a lot. We want to make sure that the people who are voting in the elections are actually eligible to vote. Is the solution to that requiring a photo ID before they vote?
That's part of the solution, absolutely. It's probably the most important part of it. To put this in perspective, after the 2000 election, of course, was very close and very contested, a bipartisan commission was formed to look at how we can improve the system and improve confidence in the system. Jimmy Carter, former president, a Democrat, was the chair of that commission, and he recommended photo ID. At the time, most states didn't have photo ID laws. So the move toward photo ID has been really only over the last 20 years. Our neighboring states have passed it: Indiana, Tennessee, Virginia. Red states, blue states around the country have photo ID laws now. Kentucky's behind the curve on this.
Do you know about how many states altogether have a photo ID requirement?
I think it's 17, 20, something like that.
Okay.
But every year it gets higher because more states are catching on and fixing this loophole.
One of the concerns with the number of states is that you have illegal immigrants voting or people who are not eligible to vote, whether it's felons that are voting. Is illegal immigrants voting in an election a concern here in Kentucky? Is that something that you're aware of?
Well, I will tell you, I've not seen any evidence based in my service on the State Board of Elections, any evidence of that happening. But I also want to ensure that we don't have that. Part of that is having accurate voter rolls. Part of that is having a photo ID law. And I'll give you one more issue. One of the issues that Heather Henry, my opponent, and I disagree on is she wants to provide ballots in multiple languages. I think that's a mistake for a couple of reasons. One is it's very expensive to have to print a separate set of ballots or to retrofit your machines or to get new software or to add machines for people who speak Spanish or French or Swahili or whatever the languages are. And the counties are strapped. The counties can barely afford their pension obligations, and they have to pay for this. And number two, if you're voting in a Kentucky election, you have to be a U.S. citizen. And one of two things is true. Either you grew up here and you've spoken English, like you and I probably have, your whole lives, or you legally immigrated to our country. You took a citizenship test to become a legal U.S. citizen, and part of that test is proficiency in English. So I don't know who these ballots are supposed to be for, but we cannot have a vulnerability in our elections like that.
That's a good point. So what, if elected, Mike, and by the way, I just want to say this again, if the viewers didn't catch us in the beginning, Heather French Henry is the Democratic nominee for Secretary of State. She was invited to this forum. She decided not to attend. And that has been the experience as you have traveled the state and you've been invited to various forums, debates. She has declined to appear with you in public or to debate in public. Have you done any events with her or joint forums, joint debates? Has she appeared in any?
No, on election night in the primary, I challenged her to 6 debates, one in each congressional district, and I offered in exchange for that to run a purely positive campaign, only on the issues, not to mention any of the scandals in her background, and just simply to talk about policy and debate policy, and she declined that. And she's declined, to my knowledge, 5 other public forums that have been offered by civic organizations, including left-leaning organizations. I've shown up because I'll talk to anybody. I'm proud of what I believe in.
Do you think it's important that candidates for a high office like this appear together and debate the issues so that the voters can see something about them? Or is it fair that she's just going to campaign on her own merits and just wants to visit the people across the state? How do you see that? Is it important for candidates?
I think it's generally important for candidates to do this. I think it's critical for candidates for this office to do this. This office is supposed to be the chief civic advocate. How can you be a civic advocate if you don't even show up for your own campaign? How are you supposed to promote voting and promote awareness? This is the number one job of this office.
Sure. So just before I went down that path, you had mentioned that Heather French Henry has proposed to print ballots, election ballots, in multiple languages. That's her proposal. What are some of the changes that you would propose if you were elected to be Secretary of State, whether it's regarding ballots or other things related to that office? Have you given thought to some other changes that would be made? I know we just talked about voter ID, cleaning up the voter rolls, but are there any other changes that you see that you would make if you were elected to that position?
Sure. Well, the number one issue in this race, from my perspective, is to clean up the scandal. We can't even have a conversation about policy until we clean up the scandal. The state's got exposure there. Yes. Legal exposure and monetary exposure because of the way that this office has treated its employees.
And by the way, you did serve on the state elections board until you decided to run. So being on the inside, so to speak, or working with that office of Secretary of State, what are some specifics that could be done to minimize the scandal or to bring about transparency in relation to that office? What some concrete things that could be done?
Well, fortunately, the legislature changed the law this year to change some of the authority of the Secretary of State, change the access to the voter file, and make some other amendments. But I'm not a believer that you pass laws to fix people's integrity. You have to elect people of integrity in the first place. I don't think that the way you solve these problems is by passing new laws. I think the way you fix it is to have a person of integrity in the office.
So that point, to have a person of integrity, you'd say that that's one of the primary things that voters should look at.
Yeah,
qualifications of a candidate.
I think qualifications are really important. And I'm the only candidate running for this office who has election experience, and that's pretty important. But I think you also have to look at moral courage. Who's the only candidate that's actually called out these scandals and criticized them and promised to fix them? My opponent's been silent on every single one of them. She dodges questions when asked about any one of the various scandals because she and Allison Grimes are very close, because she's a max-out donor to Grimes, because she's raising money from Grimes staffers. And so she's caught up in this, unfortunately.
Mike, I want us to go down a little different path. I want to ask your position on issues that might not be right on point directly related to your office, but they may tell the voters more about you. So the right to life issue, that's an issue that comes up across the board. Whether you're running for city council or governor, it's one of those issues that I think voters want to know where the candidate stands, even though you won't deal with that if you're elected Secretary of State. How do you identify when it comes to abortion and the right to life?
Well, one of the great honors I got in the primary, all four of the Republicans running for this office were pro-life, but I got the endorsement of Kentucky Right to Life. I was very honored by that. It's one of the most moving things I've experienced in this campaign. I was so honored by that endorsement. I intend to have that endorsement in the fall. That shouldn't be difficult to get, I don't think. Mrs. Henry refused to even answer the questionnaire in the primary. That was her statement, I guess, about this issue, and they have my statement.
So you are a pro-life candidate that was endorsed by Kentucky Right to Life. Where do you stand on, you're the current incumbent in that office, Allison Lundergan Grimes, has advocated for legalizing marijuana. And I don't recall if it's for recreational use or for medicinal use. In either case, she has taken a stand on legalizing marijuana. Where would you, and I know there's a distinction between the two there, but where do you stand on that issue?
So I think it's interesting. There's two different theories of government and how we should make our decisions. One approach that's been suggested is that we should decide how much revenue we want in Frankfurt, and then we should pass our laws based on how we make up our budget. How much do you want to spend? Okay, what do we have to legalize and tax so we can have the revenue for these spending programs? I'm on the other side. We can have these debates about moral policy, and that's what laws really are, is moral decisions put into law. let's have those conversations. But I think it's a real mistake to say, well, we want more money for roads and bridges, so let's legalize marijuana and tax it. I think that's absurd.
Okay. So a couple other quick fire questions. Man-woman marriage, even though the court has ruled on that a few years ago, where do you stand on marriage between a man and a woman?
I think that decision was wrongly decided. And as an attorney, specifically a constitutional attorney, I read Supreme Court decisions for fun. It's my idea of a good time. And that decision is painful to read, not just because it's wrong, but because it doesn't make any sense. There's no precedent. There's no rationality. There's no analysis. It's just what Scalia would have called an exercise of raw judicial power.
And you're referring to the Obergefell decision by the U.S. Supreme Court.
I am.
How about expansion of casino-style gambling? This has been a hot issue in the legislature for years. There is an expansion of gambling going on across the state. The racetracks have decided that instant racing is really not casino gambling. Where do you stand on that issue?
This is another issue. I don't think we should make these decisions based on how much money Frankfurt wants to spend. Let's have this debate. And by the way, we've had it already. That's why we have a constitutional prohibition on gambling in our Constitution. We've already had this discussion. I don't see any desire to reopen it by the public, but I certainly don't think that we should change our position on that because of a need for revenue in Frankfurt. Let's just cut the spending.
Okay, very good. It's true to your conservative principles. Mike, we've got just a minute. Why don't you tell the voters why they should vote for you for Secretary of State?
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank all of you for watching. I'm Michael Adams. I'm proud to be your Republican nominee for Secretary of State. I'm proud to be pro-life. I'm proud to be pro-Second Amendment. I'm proud to be the only candidate running to be the chief election official who actually has election experience. I'm also proud to be the only candidate who has the moral courage to call out the scandals in Frankfurt and offer to clean them up. I'm also proud that my platform is conservative. I'm the only conservative candidate running for this office. I think it's an office where we need a conservative. Ballot integrity is a conservative notion. My opponent signed on to Nancy Pelosi's plan at the national level. H.R. 1, Nancy Pelosi's first and primary bill in Congress, was a bill to prohibit photo ID in elections, prohibit cleaning up the voter rolls in all 50 states, require automatic registration of voters without their consent, and move to an all-vote-at-home system instead of a system like we have where you get to supervise elections and make sure that people are complying with the law and not pretending they're someone that they're not. My opponent signed on to all four of those Nancy Pelosi pillars, and I'm on the other side. So this is a great opportunity for Kentuckians to decide if we want integrity in this office and if we want a conservative.
All right. Michael Adams, candidate for Secretary of State, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Richard.
And best wishes to you on the campaign trail. And thank you for tuning in to the Commonwealth Policy Center Candidate Forum. Hi, I'm Richard Nelson with the Commonwealth Policy Center. You can find more of our videos on YouTube and Vimeo. And for more information about the Commonwealth Policy Center, go to our website, commonwealthpolicycenter.org.